यच्छन्ति देवाः सुन्वन्तं न स्वप्नाय स्पृहयन्ति.
So I sort of titled the paper as Decolonizing the Indian Mind. So I'm just breaking it a metaphor in a different way. Unbreaking Bharat. Okay. So to understand the complexity of decolonizing, we first need to understand colonization also in sort of more clearer manner. So I'll present a sort of something common to most modeling approaches in the sciences, a sort of state model, a preliminary model, over which probably we can develop, probably build a lot of thesis and a lot of discourse based on this approach. And probably I'll give an example of how the whole model could be applied in the case of Tamil Nadu. So it's sort of relevant to this conference theme also. Okay, so what exactly are we dealing with in decolonization? First, need to understand what colonization is. So again, we know the general story of imperialism, but then what exactly has the theoretical approaches been to understanding the phenomena of colonization? So we've been engaged in academia by intellectuals in the past century or more. And most of the theories to understand colonization have been from the Western colonizers' lens. Most of them have not been from the colonized person's lens. So are these lenses truly representative of the colonized? So if we use this lens to understand, there's no way we're going to decolonize ourselves. That's sort of the background. So the whole mechanism of colonization is not just this, okay, the popular thing is pillage, plunder, all of that, military, economic manipulations and loot, that's fine. But the primary tool of insubordination is the use of knowledge. And its manipulation as a source of power. Right? So the more they know about you, more they can control you. Right? This is the fundamental power in colonization, including what we are seeing today. All of this is an effect of colonization. So Edward Said, so much of the field of post-colonial studies have been influenced by his work, 70s, 80s, Arab American. So what he said was, his analysis made it possible for scholars to deconstruct literary and historical texts in order to understand how they reflect and reinforce the imperialist project. Unlike previous studies that focus on economic and political logic, he drew attention to the relationship between knowledge and power. So Pollock, the previous two conferences, is actually a reaction to all of his theories. So Said was able to undermine the ideological assumption of value-free knowledge and showing that knowing somebody was part of the project of dominating it. So it is, if I know you, I know I can actually manipulate you. That's the whole idea behind a post-colonial theory. So again, we have a lot of these theories have been advanced by our own friends. So Rajiv likes to call them as sepoys. So these are the sepoy theories. So we have the entire subaltern thesis. We have Ranajit Guha, Gayatri Spivak, 70s, 80s, and then new ones, Deepak Chibbar, Dipesh Chakravarti. They have actually tried to use the whole lens to focus on Europe as a province. And in the process, the whole discourse has been muddled of even what does it mean to be a colonizer or colonized. Everything has actually been confused. So much of the theorizing on humanities is mostly self-serving. It's mostly artificial bit of academia and removed from most realities, but which is fine. The discourse on colonization is no different. So how does it actually help us people on the field, the real victims of colonization, in any way? Right? So this is sort of the theoretical position today. So the critical impulse behind post-colonial theory has turned on itself, drawing attention to the way that it may itself be marked by utopian desire to transcend trauma of colonialism. It's just an academic exercise, seems to be, which has already played victim it has no solutions. It's just trying to sort of assuage the trauma of colonialism, nothing else. So what's the motivation for the paper approach that I'm using is, so given the historical trend of the actual utility and value of theories and ideas emanating from humanities, which is fine, both in a scientific and empirical sense and in the dharmic one, most importantly, how will such theories actually be useful to us? So any of those theories is going to help us, subaltern theories, post-colonial theory, any of it really going to help us actually to decolonize ourselves. So my sort of feeling is no. So but what does actually decolonizing mean? Does it really mean blind opposition? Does it mean blind saffronization, blind Hindutva? Does it mean I go all out a nutcase? It's not blind opposition to foreign ideas or influence. It is not blind following of anything indigenous. Neither of these is actual decolonization. The key thing is critical questioning of narratives and interpretations. And more critical questioning of every lifestyle choice that you make. And the critical questioning of media and authority. And more so when related to ideas, education, and anything in the intellectual sphere. Everything had to critically question. Vocabulary first, then the framing thesis, everything had to question. Is it actually rooted in your own tradition? Just ask that. You needn't get answers, but just seeking answers for that will actually help you decolonize. Everything. Right? So if you are to have any hope of decolonizing and any possibility of raifying the dharmic dimensions of living, you have to understand it better, much better than is currently possible. Fundamentally using Swadeshi lenses. We have to use that to even understand the process of decolonization. Just sort of give you the background from Breaking India. So I am using Breaking India as a diagnostic tool. Okay, this is actually gives a diagnosis of the problem of colonization. So I call it colonization 2.0 plus. So this is Islamic plus British. What we are in is 2.0 plus. So this is sort of the final scenario that sort of laid out by Rajiv and Arvindan. So India is sort of getting prepared for the second coming of Western Empire. Right, we are going to become the American bucks or what? The Western bucks. The foremost of Western civilization, what we are going to adopt. So this is sort of a complicated sort of state model that he has given. Bunch of things, Europe, US based, all of these are being attacked on us, and finally we're going to get recolonized again. We are getting ready as a society to get recolonized. This is as of 2011 that he has put out in this book. This is the scenario, actual scenario. How does it happen? Mechanism is this. Atrocity literature, right? Conflicts in the ground, atrocity, all this gets into everything that you see, all the Dravidian movement, all the sessions, everything is a function of these two things. So, if you were to build a model using the BI constructs, right? So, I say BI constructs, I feed it into model. Assumption, okay? So, it gives us a mechanism to understand the forces at play. And it provides a framework and identifies actors, to identify the actors, the place, what really happens, mechanisms, the tactical and strategic mechanisms. So I call them the personas and tropes. Which kind of people require which kind of input to get colonized. That they are sort of figured out by the media. Right? So you sort of try to build a model using those constructs. Right? So what does the wise man say? He says this, okay? In his own style. So why do we need a model at all? So key thing is, it's a complex organizational phenomenon. It keeps on changing. The colonization process in 1950 is not the same as happening today. Right? It's a very complex phenomenon. You have to understand how it works, how it's perpetuated, and how it actually morphs. Next thing is grapple with the complexity. Millions, if not billions, will be affected with it, and it's mind-boggling causation networks. What causes what? You do not know. From where it starts and how it changes. Why do you make a lifestyle choice? There are probably 50 things happening before you adopt a certain lifestyle choice. What is that actually? Then understanding the processes, the actors, the events, the inputs, outputs, and what are the state models actually happening. Then, if you have a model, then you can probably test and validate a hypothesis. This is why this is happening. You can understand the causality, quantify reason, then measure. Right? How is it actually perpetrated? What to measure? What's the dimension of change? And then you can sort of predict what is going to happen next, and then design. Proactively, you can think of decolonizing yourself. It's a constant process that you have to do. Then finally, you can control, manipulate, and slowly then sort of make institutionalized decolonization in society. That's the motivation behind building a model of colonization. So are we going to go all of this 15 minutes? No. I'll give a simple state model of colonization, illustration of Tamil Nadu, and possible application of these ideas. So process modeling, okay? So a process is something, action that produces something to a particular result. So what sort of events cause colonization? A specific individual or a group. So state is inner or outer state of the individual or a group that is undergoing colonization. It's physical, intellectual, emotional. State model is a set of states, transitions, events that comprise the process that's being modeled. So what are the state transitions an individual group undergo as they get colonized? So process modeling is act of representing the states of a complex process and the relationships via transitions to capture dynamics of the underlying colonization being modeled. So this is sort of the base definitions we'll work with. This is sort of common across all this modeling. So I say there are 4 big states. Right? So state 0 is the default state they're born with, or education or family. The first one is we have doubt on our identity. I'll sort of expound it slowly. The first one is we have a state, one which is called, which has a state of it's a doubt created in our own identity. So identity doubt, I call it. Then state 2 is identity shame. Like you're ashamed of who you are. So that's why I aspire for different things. Right? Then it goes to I want a new identity. Right? And then you say I get a new identity, whatever that might be. So I call these transitions as state 1 to 2 is 1.2, 1. All these transitions, all of these can happen depending on the person or the group or the community or any person that you use to model in this state. Okay, this is sort of the basic colonization. So finally, from a decolonized, from a native or whatever, from your original identity, you become colonized person in different ways. So actually, this is what actually happens. People might even go from state 1 to state 4, which is fine. So all of these have different kinds of people, different kinds of inputs they get. Right, so state 0 is default normal upbringing. So base identity created by family and society, nurture, upbringing, education. This can be your basal social conditioning. So state 1 is where the doubt is created about identity. Who am I? What am I? Right? Seeds of doubt are planted. State 2 is shame. Why should I be like this? I'm not like that. I'm not up to date. Right? So given the doubt already exists about identity, these doubts are transformed emotions of feeling and shame. It creates a sense of inferiority. That's the second step. Now the third step is, now that it has led to shame, the individual now is in search of new identity to help erase some, if not all, existing markers of identity which is causing shame. So this is a want of new identity state. And finally, the forces at play provide pre-existing tropes or identities that may be adopted by individuals or the groups seeking new identities and wanting to change themselves to be rid of the shame prevalent in previous identities. This is the state of adoption of getting new identity. It's an evolution of hyphenated identity. This is the four-step process. Right? So now exactly each of these stages has got a different process actually happening on you. Right? So I call stage 1. It's an attack or identity. Stage 2 is create shame. Stage 3 is create a desire to relinquish identity. You don't want to be yourself or whatever label associated with you. And stage 4 is you use pre-existing identities to welcome the colonized. Right? This is you converted. So you use new identity, you take pre-existing identities provided by Abrahamic systems, capitalist models, whatever. You want to become whatever. Right? So the transition is, I say 1.2 is a state 1 to state 2. That's sort of the label. So what could these be? In case we look at transition, given a example. So somebody moves from 1 to 2. So possible low self-esteem, you have a Gora complex, a self-doubt, possible mixed identities, local language, you have lack of knowledge of local language. So basically you see a modern anti-Hindu, anti-Indian education is already you're sort of prepared. And 1.3 is you are in a rapid move in search of new identity, right? Urbanization, peer pressure, change in city, country. You want to quickly fit into a new environment. You quickly move from 1 to 3. You don't even have the stage of doubt. You straight away jump to shame. Right? And then transition weakest is 1 to 4. Straight away you want to get colonized. This is the weakest link. Most modern ideas influenced by superficial left secular education offered by the institutional government. They're already mentally well prepared in stage 0 for direct transition to a colonized state. Right? The lack of any dharmic practices is a rabid Hindu doubter and is very effectively worked upon by most Hindu-phobic forces. That is the most of the Anglophilic Hindu crowd. Then you have transition 2 to 3, which is most of the populace which does not make the 1.4 transition, does a 2 to 3 transition. It's worked over first to neutral position. So generally abhors any external display of Sanatana identity. He's a modern consumer wannabe. Generally no samskaras by this stage other than a Hindu sounding name. Some semblance of a connect to dharma, possibly due to some anchors and family of friends. That's the majority state. Then transition 2 to 4 happens with evangelical forces, Islamic preaching. So new divisive identities created in a fast track mode due to proactive peddlers, pseudo-seculars, pelters of Kashmir, Tamil Hindu, etc., etc. Then you have the transition 3 to 4, which is like the westernized, liberalized, consumer Hindu. Right? So the West aping deeply colonized Hindu, or a Hindu hating, or newly minted Abrahamic. They already have made 1 to 2, 2 to 3 over the course of their life, or just tipping over. So this could be a transition. I'm just giving, this could be called tropes or personas. So now what are these 4 things actually mean? So what actually causes doubt in identity? So that's actually an attack on the civilization. That's called civilizational weakening. So what is this cause of shame? They use structures in your own civilization to actually weaken the structure and cause shame on you. So the whole nature of Varna is given a caste discourse. So you're ashamed of the notion of Varna itself. I find that's a classic example of structural weakening of your civilization. Next thing is encourage separatism. So that causes a desire to seek new identity. Once all these three are done, so actually you become ripe to get absorbed into a colonized identity. This is how the entire population sort of worked out. So all the events in media are actually these four different things, but we all see it as one single thing. So we really don't understand what's happening to us, which is sort of the motivation behind the whole modeling story. So just to give an example, I'll give you a case study of Tamil Nadu. So can these BI descriptions be mapped into state model? Can we model the past 70 years of Tamil Nadu into this model? Can it not? Okay, take an example Tamil Nadu. So again, this is again using BI, attack on identity, de-Indianizing, Christianizing, colonial impact, okay, attack on identity. These are the 13 standard tropes that we have in Tamil Nadu. Hinduism, India, Aryan invader, Dravid, Tamil nation, anti-Indi caste system. There are actually 4 different kinds of attacks, but we think it's all one. That's why given different color codes, they're not the same, they're all different. How different? First one is this. So just take a look at this. So all of these are 4 different tracks on us. Right? Civilizational attack, structural attack, separation attack, and a right picking attack. So all these 4 are different. But all of them actually say it's sort of general anti-Tamil argument. Actually, there are 4 different things happening to us. So this is sort of, if you really want to go and model, 1947, 2017, that is data on conversion. That's Christians and Muslims, what's happened in the last 50 years. So again, other measures we have, that is one measure. These Tamil identities, Hindu-phobic identities, daily outrage, temple destruction, the media. Right? So all of these are actually the other measures of examining that. So what is this model can apply to all scenarios. A state model described as a layman example. Generality process models make it widely applicable. Right? So applications. So how would you actually solve this fundamental? So we understood colonize. Now how to decolonize? So use ideas of from being different. So I call it solutioning. Use Drishti guidelines from being different. Right? Understand processes, media, role of tech. Right? So biggest risk for us is definition of what is dharma. Right? It can be easily, whole process can be derailed by derational persons and non-indic baselines. So you can build a colonization index. Each of us actually, if you have a proper sort of story behind this modeling, each of us can say what is our Swadeshi index. Actually, you can build on top of this. So your identity, your fundamental 3 dimensions, terms of identity factor, lifestyle factor, aspiration. All of this, you can make a simple number. You say, what's your Swadeshi number? Are you 1 or 8? Are you 1? Right? How dharmic are you? You can actually figure that out empirically. So you can do it using apps, whatever. Right? Next thing is media monitoring. You can monitor your like petabytes of data every day. Right? How do you process this conversation automatically? Algorithm available. How do you process the algorithm? Use heuristic product by being different. Triangulate, understand, quantify. Select conversation, amplify. All of this can be done if you have the model in place. So actually pretty easy if somebody wants to build technically, but then it's a process of just building it out. It needs many long-running campaigns to actually do media decolonization. It has to be done this way. We can't do it piecemeal. Many more. Right? You can use the whole thing to actually regenerate those social sciences. Curricular research, it's all about Drishti. So you need a reference model, we can build that. Think tanks can use all of this to build data-driven dashboard. This community, what's its colonization state today? Instead of an index for a person, you can have an index for a community itself. Right? So finally, what a wise man says, he says, Swadeshi we must. He actually figured out. The first step to colonization is this. He's actually based on an Indian story. If you thought of read Rajiv's reference to Lucas, this is a Kshatriya model. Right? So takeaways. Engage with complex using process models. So intellectuals use a system thing as an intellectual tool. Technologists should build systems, apps, leverage process model, put dharmic use. Think tanks, governments, and etc. should use the big picture modeling to essential to understand decolonization. Metrics, processes, measure, and act. Right? So way ahead is you're going to get more and more in data. Tech is the only way to understand it. So as a nation, as a civilization, are we ready even to process this? So understanding the process, only hope for anything for you to succeed. That sort of should be the takeaway. Yeah. Yeah.
More than 5 minutes for questions.
So I have a question which says, can we use this to reverse the process? Yes, that's the whole idea of the model. No? Once you have the model, you can do whatever you want. Can we use this modeling for Ghar Vapsi programs? And we can have many kinds of Ghar Vapsi. When you say Ghar Vapsi, it means one Ghar. There are so many different Ghars in India. You can use it for all the Ghars. Okay. The model equally applies to NRI families who take foreign citizenship, try to agreed. So the whole notion of NRI, geography, all that is fine. Again, all of that is sort of valid in this. So how do you want to apply this model? So somebody can take this and apply to NRIs, for example. You want to apply to NRI Tamil, apply. I want to apply to NRI Telugu, apply. Right? The whole point is how do you use, you need a base model first. So out of the 6 transition groups, which one is the most easiest to be brought back to Indic culture? The toughest not to crack. I think easiest will be the people of identity, doubt and shame. The ones who already flipped, have made lifestyle choices, they're very difficult to get them back. So what is the assumption in the model? Assumption is we are being colonized. Okay, if you think we are not being colonized, he's saying what is assumption in the model? See, if you can say this is not being colonization.
Okay,
Correct. Correct.
I'll
Agree.
take the
Agree.
liberty of asking you the last question. So it's about I want to invert the model. For example, let us say, because Jyotirmaya has just edited a volume on by Asian Studies journal in once again Freiburg. So in one of the, I worked on a phenomenological critique of a Dalit theory. Okay. So let us say that your model is advocated by Professor Gopal Guru, who is actually a Dalit ideologue or Dalit critic. And he comes to the exactly same conclusion about rest of the castes, and how are you going to engage with that?
I mean,
He
which
comes-
is fine, no?
No.
Which is fine.
No, but you are talking about a meta-narrative, a grand narrative of
Correct.
Hindu philosophy, culture, religion. you
I'm
know.
talking from, yeah.
But
Correct.
he's going to exactly use the same formula, same model,
Correct.
everything,
Correct.
and basically obliterate whatever you have said about the.
Based on what? You need,
He's-
this is going to be powered by media data. So
No, not media
it's
data.
not just,
Same
that's
like-
what I'm saying.
no, no,
The
Dalit-
model here,
See, the data is not only you are my purview, right?
one second.
It's
So that's
actually-
why I'm saying the model will be populated by petabytes of data. So give me petabytes of data.
No, see, you have let us say, Dalits also have media awards, they also have
Correct.
data, everything.
Correct.
For example, I'm also giving a kind of poster as a kind of a theoretical model.
Correct.
Okay, you don't have to take it substantively as this thing. I'm giving you a kind of a hypothetical question where they use the same modeling,
Correct.
everything to come up with a completely different solution.
Correct.
Then how are you going to engage with that? That's my. Almost 5-6 years ago in Madras University, there is a Center for Dravidian Studies. Okay, I was the only guy there. I can openly say this. I was the only Brahmin in the entire group. They were punching me right, left, and center. I was beaten black and blue. Not literally, but okay. But this is exactly what they were saying.
Correct.
Okay.
So correct. So all of
Exactly saying that how many like positions Brahmins held, or these people held, that people held. Everything statistics they also gave. With 100 books or whatever, it's fictitious, non-fictitious, that anyway I didn't have the wherewithal to this thing. So my question is, we cannot have this unilateral meta-narrative that doesn't engage with the petty narratives or smaller narratives. So I want to see how the model engages or incorporates those kinds of narratives. See, if you take Mahabharata, there are 25,000 branch stories, right? You cannot, in Ramayana say, Ravana took Sita, Rama killed Ravana, end of Ramayana. You cannot say this, right? So it's extremely complex, multi-layered, multi-dimensional. So I want this model to also engage with those kinds of multi-layered, multi-dimensional.
agreed. That's what I'm saying. This is just a base model to model all of those. See, all of those is also a transition. That's all I'm saying. All of this is just a base model for all of those.
It's a
Agreed.
very interesting exercise. Sorry for taking more time. I'll probably go to the next speaker.
Thanks.
நமஸ்தே அனைவருக்கும் வணக்கம். I'm a young scholar. I'm a little panicked to deliver my. The topic is Hindu phobia in Tamil television, a critical discourse analysis. This study is an attempt to map the obscure visual texts and the visual discourse of spiritual leader Paramahamsa Nityananda and Ms. Ranjita News, which is telecast by Sun Television. Television is one of the very important communication medium, as well as it has a power to quickly influence the people's mind. Research has been proven intensely this modern television. The prime invention of the media is informative and entertainment. Nowadays, this tune is the tune of the media is changing from information to sensationalization. In Tamil Nadu, the highly reputed and important television channels are run by lineage of Dravidian net. From the side of Dravidian tradition, they have the very different and unique vision of the Hindu culture. However, in the matter of religious discourse that appear in the television, they follow strong sense of neutrality in the concern of program production. But when it comes to the matter of this Nityananda, the neutrality is gone somewhere. The study employs with the qualitative critical discourse analysis of the existing television content which is available in YouTube. The CDA is very peculiar theory and method to uncover the invisible and biased communicated religious discourses. So there are a lot of scholars supported this framework. About Hindu phobia. Hindu phobia is more dangerous than any other ideology in today's civilization. Hindu phobia is not or an individual stereotype that afflicts some individual. It is a systematic distortion in human thought that serves to distract the world from the cruelty and the needlessness of suffering. Not just Hindu, but all human and non-human suffering too. This is mentioned by Vamsi Jury. Racism, fundamentalism, sexism, these are dangerous, no doubt, and exist, but these are recognizable. People will know to get outraged. Most Hindu denied Hindu phobia, and many interpret the episode that are pointed out as positive marker of this tolerance. Hindu phobia and media. There are a lot of scholars who mentioned Washington Post, which is spontaneously distorted our traditions in a very pathetic way. Then Hindu character on American television will mostly not be a realistic representation of Hinduism. According to Pare, interfered in Hindu phobia, which telecast in CNN. So these are the very controversial issue came to Varanasi. So many of scholars sorry. Then film Sexy Durga. This is a recent controversy which has happened in our country. So actually in my original paper I have not mentioned this last one, but this is a contemporary one. That's why I added this. Regarding to these issues, the Kerala High Court says this like. So they are guided to produce the censored version of copy and guided to change the name. It's Sexy to S Durga something. So unfortunately, the director who made the change S XXX, which is posted then band-aid manner. Then he admitted to the censor board. Again, censor board denied to screen this movie. So this was the real things. Unfortunately, that IFFI denied to screening that person, the director and the actor itself, the Kannan Nair, who posted this like, "Oh, you are so sexy, Vishnu." So following this is Hindu phobia. This is Hindu phobia in media, particularly social media. Religious discourse in media. Dealing with the religious discourse and its representation in media, few questions arises. To what extent does the mere presence of the religious character influence an audience's attitudes toward the religious? The hidden dimension of television and news discourses. As we are well known, television news is like a lightning flash. It makes loud noise, light up everything around it, leaves everything else in a darkness and then suddenly gone. So there is nothing out from then after. This methodological approach I follow my studies. Critical discourse analysis is a branch of discourse analysis which in the late 1980s has been discussed many linguistics such as Fairclough and Van Dijk CDA may be seen as a reaction against the dominant uncritical paradigms of the linguistic theory. Van Dijk is regarded as one of the most quoted scholars in the field of critical discourse studies, especially in media discourses. So that's why I mentioned Van Dijk. News media is something to which members of more powerful social groups and institutions, and especially their leaders, have more or less exclusive access. This visual contents, which is broken the credibility in multiple level. The first is skeptical. For instance, this is issues which is telecasted by Sun TV during 2010. Actor Ranjitha and Swami Nityananda was that sexual activities which is going on their private room. That is the visuals. That time that media's trumped with that kind of visuals. So I have taken that visual content and admitted to my analysis. Okay. Shall I proceed my analysis, sir? Thank you. The visual has broken the credibility in multiple levels. The first is skeptical. The actor Ranjitha responds to the television interview question, even that does not clarify that the visuals are true or false. The highly reputed channel, Sun TV, failed to cross-check the content. Even though the two victims are somewhere considered as important personality in the society. That is one thing. The people depend on the news matter basically disseminated by a television. Generally, that doesn't have the time to validate the content because they depend on a reputed channel like Sun TV. But in the name of the prime time news concern, they are made believe this kind of libidinal strongly. Unfortunately, they doesn't have the chance to validate, that is people. The general people never think whether this matter concerns the individual privacy and the personal space. The visual discourse are made as well as telecasted in the highly influential approaches. Among the people, the visual narration are created in a decided way to influence. Probably this visual content would have been created by the well-professional technician with the sense of the local skills. This visual narrated in the sense of the spontaneous act. This is some of techniques while making the visuals. This technicality of narration offer an imbibed, highly concrete statement toward the general viewer. The visual discourse is not for the one day. It has been the continuous act of them. In the lively sense-making way, the background object are some of the everyday elements which psychologically convince the general audience to believe the story within the convenience narrative discourses. This technique used to narrate the story provide an attractive credibility toward the general public. The visual language discourses are manipulated in purposive narrative which explicit that the video content were edited in the conscious of coherent manner that never could be noticed by the general viewer. For instance, some narrative frames are similar like Nityananda and Ranjitha, but when it juxtaposed with the sophisticated rotoscopic technique, this particular technology helped to create coherent narration without notion. The other important manipulated discourses is long and closed frame of narration. When the closed narrative frames appear in the screen, which is consciously placed the uncleared notion within the narrative. But when the audience met some of the narrative notion, they suddenly manage with the erotic visuals. That is some technical. This narrative is very crucial and it is very notorious act of ordinary television content. This is more than stringent yellow journalism. This power-centered ideological narrative discourses seeks very specific apparatus required to uncover the truth. This very crucial narrative approaches is more than the porn discourses. During the telecast of this concerned video in Sun TV, changed the face of its own from the regular tune to sudden reds in the side of the porn telecast. this visual discourse crossed the code and ethics of television channel. Moreover, the telecasted obnoxious frame in the front of general public who are children, adult of their parents itself. In the consent of the sensational, they failed to recollect the basic citizen courtesy. Finally, in the case of sexual scam, the victim face or other sexual kind of act is prohibited in the television broadcasting. This visual content has failed to scrap the unethical visibility, but this is visual followed the tactics of making it exposed as much as possible. The ideological sense of the visual narration in the discourse is very complex but easily to influence and induce the people. When we are exposed to this religious based content, people suddenly connect religious and society, making us question how this religious superior actors dislike without giving us a space to think over its truth or falsity. The news is under the scrutiny of cognitive dissonance and also created the complex notion among the people. My conclusion about this study: television is one of the powerful communicative medium in our society which should have more concern and have to create the powerful impact among the people. In this concern, to cover the religious, caste and sex related issues should be very cognizant and unbiased. This study shows that visual narrative language are very stringent and manipulated discourses that create with the modern sophisticated morphed technology. However, telecasted by Sun TV, this organization has gone under the deception in the name of the news dissemination, and also through these unethical textual discourses to state a very complex notion among the people, especially the people believe in Hindu religion, and manipulated with highly influenced negative pulse. This kind of unethical and invalid news discourses and the channel are always frightening the Indian society as well as the government. Finally, this study recommends to implement the strong and very effective monitoring methods and the regulation to preserve the unbiased telecasting news. Thank you. So, Bangalore Civil Court order on 22 November 2007, more than national television channel replayed the morphed video which first appeared on 2nd March 2010. This video has been condemned by 4 international forensic agencies, court of various countries, and Bangalore Civil Court even passed the sum of fine or something like that. So this is very recently announced that court order. So thank you.
Yeah,
Sorry.
This is an excellent exposition on media ethics, and it's open for questions.
Just to support this.
I'm asking this, I'm Hariharan, education psychologist.
Yeah,
I'm
please.
asking this question in support of this presentation, actually because there's a very interesting point I felt in this presentation. I want everybody to be made clear of that particular point. It's a very important and interesting point. So if you could say that in just a few sentences for us once again, it will be very nice. What I'm asking is actually how they morphed and technologically how they very intelligently cheated the public. That can you just brief it? That's a very
Thank you.
interesting. Please.
Thank you. Very interesting question itself. So I am also very happy to answer. From some interview, Ranjita itself says about when Swami is some kind of fever or something like that, the devotee itself voluntarily help them. So they serve water, tablet, something like that. So that kind of visuals are there. Actually, some of people stolen these visuals and created some other room or something else in a same manner. So they were mixed with these two visuals with sophisticated technology, that retroscopic technology. That is a morphed visual editing software. Through this help of they made possible.
My name is Sujeev Kommana. I'm a
Sir.
lorry driver from Canada. I want to make sure that, are you a follower of Swami Nityananda, just for the record?
Not it.
All right. So you
I don't need.
How come you chose this topic? What made you choose?
When I searching Hindu phobia in televisions, I found a lot of information. Actually, professor itself guide me some of visuals. You have to find it something like that. So in my own way, I searching. When I searching a lot of this kind of Hindu-phobic materials, this is struck my mind. That's why I taken. After only the court itself saying, I was a panicked, so whether it was right or wrong, but my study itself saying it's positive response. But that based on my studies, but even though I have some confusion, after the court itself saying it was fake, it's more for something else. That is made some more clarity of my studies. Thank you.
Devendra Jalihal, a faculty in electrical engineering, IIT Madras. So, I hear many people say it was a morphed image. I mean, let's consider this. Suppose Swami Nityananda had sex with the lady in question, right? The critical question to ask is it the media credible that displays the whole thing disregarding the person's privacy, right? As a citizen, Swami Nityananda is entitled to his privacy. So could that be a question to ask? Right?
Yeah, that.
I mean, forget about Hindu. Hindu phobia is your thesis. Could that be that a camera cannot invade into a
The
person's
private,
bedroom?
yeah.
Right. I mean, would that be a question? Did anybody raise this question? Was there a debate along these lines?
Yeah, from my analysis, I somewhere I point out that Ranjita itself, before telecasting this kind of issues, the concerned journalist or the person should make clarification about the concerned persons. So whether you are or not, you are, it may be more for something like that. Such kind of the progress is not happening in this case, as well as the private case itself. They were not considered. This is a private things or something like that. Thank you for your response.
Namaste and hello. This is Ravi Joshi for the Swadeshi Indology Conference number 3. My co-author Yamuna Harshavardhana and I will be presenting a 2-part paper on Dravidianism. So let's start with part 1 that I will be presenting, followed later by part 2 by Yamuna. Dravidianism with language equaling race. The third wheel in Tamil-Sanskrit interactions. The introductory slide basically introduces what we are trying to say essentially about Western Oriental Indological scholarship, and we trace the establishment of the heavily racialized politics in Tamil Nadu over the past 100 years or so, and why it worked so well in Tamil Nadu as opposed to neighboring states of Kerala, Karnataka, Andhra and Telangana. We problematize the whole underlying idea of language equals to race, and also we do a deep dive into the foundational premises of Dravidianism in the realms of culture, language and politics. So this is basically why Dravidianism is a basically third wheel, and it's a redundant or superfluous entity. And now we come to the underlying ideas behind the Western locational technologies which have taken over our description of the world. Space and time have been described and put in terms of the star chart and the Eusebius, and then based on these comes the tree of nations, which is based on mosaic ethnology, and the diagram on the right basically is how the framework was laid in. All newly discovered people had to fit into this based on the technologies of time and space. We know that the world people were divided into 3 types based on which sons of Noah they were born from. Then the key concept is the Tower of Babel, which essentially is the biblical mythology of how humanity dispersed from a central place in time and space. Then how this ties into the concept of family of languages. Languages are essentially treated as units, like members of a family, like an individual. So this is a very questionable assumption, but that's what it is. And then we come to the entire edifice of historical linguistics that holds up the whole idea of Dravidianism. The basis is, again, we just showed the Mosaic ethnology. It talks about one parent, one family, from one point spreading outwards. Some of the models for that would be something like this. The model on the left shows how a proto-language comes about through year 0 over to year 1000, then moving over to year 2000. And then the next one is after a proto-language, then people again disperse, and then at year 0, this is a new year 0, how through migrations you start having a language family. And we know that the prototype of the historical linguistic model is the Indo-European family of languages. And this model has been used now to construct all kinds of families globally, so that this historical linguistics has taken on a global flavor. So now the current theories are based on obsolete mechanistic analogies, and this is how we are problematizing. We say that this is not what it should be, and these paradigms may need some retirement, and the Aryan Dravidian are much closer than Indo-European. So let's go a little deeper into this. The whole point is, in this era of scientific falsifiability and the fact that in today's world, way different from the world of the 19th and 20th century, there's a lot of ability for us to do real serious data gathering and really make a theory sound and falsifiable. So the question is the Indo-European language family falsifiable? And this, from Angela Mercantonio's wonderful study, the framework that she has used, the 3 boxes: comparative method and sound laws, role of morphology, and is there a prehistoric reality. These are the key areas through which she basically shows that neither at the level of words, nor at the level of grammar, or at the level of combining linguistics with archaeology and genetics, is there any serious scientific basis established as yet. Maybe it might be tomorrow, but today it certainly is not. Moving on again, we just want to show that there are other counter proposals that we should be making in order to carry on this research from the Indian language area. So this is one proposal of Subhash Cox. One key point I would like to make is that if we look at linguistics and historical linguistics especially, all the data is basically about Europe, mostly Western Europe. Every other data is just corroboration. So sometimes it almost feels like this is a European language family. They just cannot get rid of the Indo part of it, which is fine by us. The Indian language area itself is a big enough area for us to really get a lot of traction in terms of gathering real serious data and comparing languages. Our idea is not as simple binary thing. There's a lot of overlap, as you can see here on the right side. We contrast the Western linguistic paradigm that we just saw in the couple of slides before with the Indic traditional linguistics. This is just a very simple sketch of the framework that the traditional linguistics had. I intentionally use the word had because right now it's almost defunct in terms of the global linguistic science. So we have from Sanskrit, the grammarians used to classify structurally and functionally all the languages that they saw. So the first stop was Prakrit, and they would identify Tat, Sama and Tadbhava words in that. The next step would be Desha and Gramya, words that are very, very local languages without much refined structure grammatically, etc. And then there was Bhasha, Vibhasha, Apabhramsha and Paishachi as grades and levels of speech. And then if you talk geographically, then for the south, they also had Kanchidesha, Dakshinatya and Dravida as classifications. The Sanskrit Vyakaran became the basis of Prakrit Vyakaran, and this is shown in the Shastra that the high register was Sanskrit and the low register was the local Prakrit. And as the Vyakaranas kept evolving, all the Prakrits got Sanskritized. This was kind of the picture that Campbell used to refute Carey, etc., using Ellis's implied framework. Now, Ellis's implied framework is what basically caused the Dravidian family of languages to emerge as a logical real family. So now we basically see from the past many slides that it's essentially a clash of models and systems. On the left side is the Sanskritization model. which worked and should actually work again if we use it for further research into Indian languages and Indian society versus the westernization model. After this, I think the next slide is essentially showing the past 500 years, what that has done to the self-perception of Indians, specifically with the idea of Dravidian ideology. And this is about the borrowing of the Christian lens, which we already saw in the Mosaic ethnology about languages. And beyond that, the next couple of slides are all about how Frykenberg basically asserts that how the Christianity is a solution for native problems. So these are the many problems that they want to show. Indian elites, it's always about the elites, specifically about Brahmin bashing, and also about trying to make this sort of a utopian claim for the underclass, which never really bears out in reality. So at the end of the day, you can see where the political violence and all these anti-Brahminism and non-Hinduism, etc. come from. And at the end, this is the summary. Thank you.
Namaskaram. Now we'll be adopting Purva Paksha to engage with the foundational premises of Dravidianism. Now, what has been done is they have adopted Aryan invasion theory and used it to actually dichotomize everything. It would be race, language, religion, caste, as well as nation. So we will see how they have done it, and they have used a method which was also modeled on Aryan invasion theory. The next is this dichotomy of Aryan versus Dravidian, and here you see a quote by EVR, who is a so-called prophet of Dravidianism in Tamil Nadu, and whatever he says becomes a Bible of those who are his followers. Now, the word Aryan is found in Sangam literature, and several of its variants are also found. And as we can see here, in none of these usages is there any kind of racial implication. It is used as in multiple meanings, with multiple meanings. The word Dravida itself is clearly not of Tamil origin, as it violates two of the grammatical rules of Tamil. The very first use in Tamil literature is found to be made by Yogi Tayumanavar in the 18th century. He has adopted this into Tamil language and not used as a root word in Tamil itself. And according to Vaishnavite scholar Sri Naranacharya, the word Dravida denotes one who is from the richer southern parts of the subcontinent. Here is, I have taken from Tirunjana Sambandhar's Thevaram, where he alludes to Lord Shiva and says Aryan Kandai, Tamilan Kandai, thereby clarifying any doubt in the mind that there is, he epitomizes Shiva in the form of both Aryan and Tamilan. So these definitions and usages clearly disprove premise 2 of the Dravidianists. Next premise is Tamil versus Sanskrit, again from the Dravidianist Bible. One quote I have given here, where he says that the Tamil language, which was used, is superior until Sanskrit was imposed. Now there is enough evidence to show that both the languages, Sanskrit as well as Tamil, evolved and were nurtured on the subcontinent itself. Not a single shred of evidence to show that Sanskrit was imposed on Tamil or any other language for that matter. From Tirumular's Tirumandaram, we see it goes Panditaravar, Padanittu Padim, and so on. It says the 18 various languages that the Panditas speak were all given by Lord Shiva himself. There is nothing superior, everything has a divine origin. The Brahmi script, again it was mentioned earlier by Devapriya ji, that it is prevalent all over the continent. Then this premise again is doesn't have any value, because there is nothing that says Aryan is pitted against Tamil in any sense. The next is what they call as rationalism as against religion. They say in the ancient Tamil language, everybody was rational. They did not have irrational, what they termed as irrational rites and rituals. They were monotheistic, kind of an utopian egalitarian society, and so on. And again, that Tirukural was written to condemn what they termed to be Arya Dharma, which apparently in that Arya is non-Tamil. So we know very clearly, by now there have been so many experts who have clarified that the four varnas have been mentioned in so many of our ancient literary works, and we find the word varnam in Tamil is the same as varna in Sanskrit, and in Palamudi Nanuru we come across the word varnattar used to categorize people based on their nature. It is the same as the Varna system that we follow. It is not on the skin color, it is based on the nature. And again, Purananuru mentions several rites and rituals, rites of passage, again of widowhood, of ancestral worship, and so on. Again, custom and caste with respect to individuals when it came to marriage has been mentioned there. No, I don't think there is a mention of caste with respect to this compatibility kind of a thing with respect to any other sense. So from the above we see whatever is claimed under this premise has nothing, no water, it contains no water, and it is just a figment of visual imagination of the Dravidians. Again from the Dravidianist Bible, one more quote, who is a Brahmin and who is a Dalit. So the Dravidianists have demonized Brahmins, who became their paranoid reference point for every social evil that was prevalent, even sometimes imagined social evils also. And there are so many loose ends in their assumptions and accusations that they have not been able to answer, or they have evaded answering. It just shows a simplistic shallowness of their premise or their stance. They claim that they are against Brahminism but not against Brahmins themselves. But the same EVR has been very virulent and foul when he has condemned Mahakavi Subramanya Bharati, just because he was born in a Brahmin family, although he himself was a very strong social reformer and he was considered a rebel. So then the same sentiment, this is not in the past, in the same sentiment is reflected until date by Veeramani. They have what I would say, they have perpetuated anti-Brahminism, and also either supported or ignored the perpetration of crimes against the Dalits, because in one of the studies it was found that the number of crimes against the Dalits, invisible crimes like not filling positions that are reserved, and whatever has been extended to the Dalits is probably lesser but not more than what is provided for in the constitution of the union, the same union that they do not want to belong to. And they have the perpetration has still continued, it has not waned off, and this premise has no basis. They cannot divide a society into two parts because we are not a two-part society. Then the next premise is that social justice can be obtained by destroying social order. So this is ideally modeled on Aryan invasion theory, where they argue back, you came and you destroyed everything that was ours, now we are going to go get back and do the same. And then they have done a lot of destructive activities, as is seen, both physical destruction as well as destruction of the existing social systems and all that. One of them I would want to mention is they fought very hard to end the Devadasi system under the pretext of women empowerment, which is absolutely unfounded, because even I have not shown on the slide, but Tirumular has spoken about the Devadasi system as one of the must to follow the Vedic life. So one of the ways they used to kind of justify what they are doing is do this indiscriminate conflation of terms, and they say Aryan is a Brahmin, who is a Hindu, who is a so on. Actually I can add two more, who is a non-Tamil, who is a non-Dravidian. So this is and lot of things like that. So this absurdity, if they have not kind of justified the absurdity that is there behind all this. Okay, and they claim that EVR did what was the need of the day, but this is far from the truth. This table shows the approach taken by the Dravidianists in Tamil Nadu, which was the destructive way, as against Narayana Guru in adjacent Kerala, which was a corrective way. And the left-hand column shows that there were identical social problems that were targeted, and the two columns on the right show the differences in the approaches that both of them took. And the overall outcome was that the Dravidianists widened the social divisions, castes are politically pitted against one another, and they rely on reservation as a way of social upliftment. Narayana Guru's his movement did not have any of these negatives, and the quality of life of their downtrodden was elevated considerably, and Kerala's high literacy achievement was because of their movement and not what the communists did as being claimed by them. We can very easily study West Bengal model, where they had a longer communist rule and they are far behind Kerala in literacy. Premise 6. So premise 6 has totally failed. Then this is the last premise, sir. I'll take some more time. Okay, this is nationalism versus Tamil nation. So this is the thing where they had a great non-Brahmin polity, civilization, and so on and so forth. So right from the beginning, they did not participate in the independence struggle. He supported Jinnah in forming Pakistan. EVR called for burning of the copies of Indian Constitution. They have condemned the nationalistic fervor of Subramanya Bharati. In short, they propound a system of ethnic cleansing where they want the so-called Dravidian Dalits as part of the Tamil nation that will be formed, and get rid of all the so-called Aryan Brahmins out. And then we will see what our texts talk about Brahmins in the past. Tirumandram says, Avyam, Pavyam, Matrattu, Varim, and so on, where he says, if the cow, the woman, and the sacred Brahmins are not protected by the king, then the king will be condemned eternally. And we will also see what Tirukural, which is a book held sacrosanct by the Dravidianists, say. It reflects the identical thing, which was yesterday also it was shown, that if the the cow's milk will dry up and the Brahmins will forget the scriptures when the king stops being their savior. So this is a paradox. You cannot, I don't have to go further on this. So this premise 7 also has no grounding. This is a summary. So AIT is gone, and all these theories have gone. Most ancient Tamil texts and other evidences have no conflict whatsoever with the dharmic traditions. Whichever direction the flow of thoughts and traditions took within the nation, it has been a seamless and syncretic one. There was no us versus them in any sense. Dravidianism failed in the objectives because it was not established in Dharma. So the conclusion is, any idea of exclusivity of Tamils or Dravidians from the rest of the nation is imagined and can be discarded outright. Thank you very much. This is a wonderful opportunity I have got.
Madam, wait, you have questions to answer.
Yes, I am waiting.
So
Let
now
me see
it's
if I
question
can.
time, and should I read this?
Yeah. The question is whether Christian missionaries are associated with DK. Apparently it is so. From some of the writings that I have seen, there seems to be a kind of a nexus between the Christian missionaries and the Dravida Kazhagam.
So, two very quick questions. Madam, Devaram that you mentioned, what is the period that it pertains to?
Okay, Devaram period, I think it is between the 6th to the 9th centuries, if I'm right. I'm not 100% sure when this particular Devaram was written. I did not get into that.
Mr. Ravi, there is a question that I'm supposed to read to you. Are you here? Okay. Sanskrit was a very well developed language. Is there evidence to show it was widely spoken in India, both in north and southern parts of the country? Was it a language of the masses? This is actually, I don't have the name of the person who has asked this question.
That's fine, but that gives me a chance to again go back to My slide number 19, I don't know if it can be shown on the screen or it doesn't matter. Anyway, the point I think I would like to make is differentiating between the reality of languages that are spoken and the modern language or the abstraction of the language that one does for analysis. Okay? So there's a huge difference between the way the Indic grammarians abstracted language in order to analyze it and kept track of how the real language was being spoken by the people. And that is why we have all these ideas about Sanskrit. In Sanskrit grammar, you have pure Sanskrit words, and when we talk of an actual language, which would be typically called a Prakrit, then the Prakrit is generally populated with Tat Sama and Tat Bhava, which are Sanskrit-like, Sanskrit-based words, and the grammar which can be derived from Paninian Sanskrit. Then you have Desya and Gramya, okay, which cannot be derived from Sanskrit. So all real languages do have words which cannot be derived from Sanskrit. So that's why Sanskrit is more in the nature of being a very well-developed meta-language in order to help people to, number one, analyze languages, and number two, also civilize their own languages. And civilization in the sense that you can make your language more structured. And this is kind of the way in which Sanskrit was being taken by rest of India as well as Southeast Asia and beyond. So when you talk about people speaking Sanskrit, it is probably that's one big difference between Sanskrit and Tamil, if I understand. Even Rajiv Malhotra also alluded yesterday that Tamil is really a proper, robust, complete language. When you say Tamil, you mean a language. When you say Sanskrit, it's a little more complicated. It can function as a language, but it generally functions as a meta-language, and then people kind of reduce it to call it as a language of ritual and so on and so forth.
Thank you very much.
This fissure that you're talking about between the Aryan and the Dravidians that has been created, we can talk about it in conference rooms and we can discuss it, all that is fine, but I want to know, is there a way we can make it a movement? Because I think there is a real danger of forces outside India that are breaking India forces that are taking advantage of this and in fact creating fictitious situations where they're saying that there was a time when there was a Kumari Kandam and that if the Dravidian land is separated as a nation from the entire country, based on all this, that they would do far better than the rest of the country because we are more prosperous, more educated. Is there a way that
that
we
is
can
what
do
I
something
think is Infinity Foundation is working to do ultimately. As individuals, we can all go around trying
As
to
lay
spread it.
persons, is there
Yes, spread it on a face-to-face basis or via social media. One of the tendencies I have seen is that when I am on a few WhatsApp groups, for example, there are some of the members in that group who are not Hindus, either Christians. They are very willing to share some Islamic quote or Christian, but we are very shy of doing such things, and we are even shy of condemning what they have quoted. So those things, I think we should start, we don't have to offend them, but we can start questioning them. So, I mean, we don't have to come across as very crude people, but we can come across as smart people. We are not, as a matter of fact. Even on Facebook, somebody goes, keeps arguing. There are certain elements who are very irritating. They keep coming to your post, and many of the people keep coming and saying, block out this person. But I don't block, because only when they post, we can answer to them. So they would get exposed only if we let them come and commit the mistakes out in the open. If you keep blocking them out, then the purpose is lost totally.
So excellent. Thank you very much, madam. 3 excellent papers. Please take care. So the first paper was titled Decolonizing the Indian Mind by T.N. Sudarshan. very excellent model of tracing various ideological impositions on the Indian thought. He started with Edward Said's Orientalism, and where Said claims that no value-free knowledge. And he was also talking about academic theorizing in captivity. But he was also actually clearing up his model as not a blind opposition to other ideas or also blind support to Hindutva or any ideology for that matter. And it's a critical evaluation of all ideas that are put forth. So he referred to Breaking India, a volume by Raju Malhotra, and from where he has derived his inspiration for the model of decolonization. He used the word reifying, but reifying is not actually a very positively used word because it's more like hypostatization. We don't want ideas to be reified or hypostatized. We want ideas to be fertile and dynamic. So that is my one point of disagreement with T.N. Sudarshan. And he actually then went on to the T.N. model of colonization. It's an extremely thorough modeling. Then I also actually mentioned that it's a kind of only first stage of modeling which will be developed further with more data and also more kind of accommodation of varying and differential in approaches and also ideas. So he also talked about the progression of the colonization apparatus from doubt to shame to wishing or wanting new identity and then going for a new identity. So then the second paper was about by Mr. Pradeep, Hindu phobia in Tamil TV. So he talked about also media ethics in a broad light, but he took this Swami Nityananda and Ranjita's episode as a case study. And there are many others. You can also mention, actually this was done by Jayalalitha herself when Kanchi Shankaracharya was arrested, once again very murky circumstances. And so he probably could have elaborated more on the entrapment where many of the television channels and many of the media are actually much more comfortable in attacking the majority religion, culture, than minority. Okay, probably we should also make the minorities feel protected and welcome, but there seems to be a very clear bias against they call it establishment religion or establishment culture or dominant culture, whatever. So Mr. Pradeep very effectively showed how there is this kind of Hindu phobia in the Tamil television channels especially, and especially the Sun TV. Now it has kind of morphed into kind of appearing much more equanimous because they also have a lot of programs in the morning. They telecast a lot of pravachanams and a lot of temple festivals, and then probably they also realize that that's where the market is. So they have kind of morphed into now much more secular in the real sense of the term, not as anti-Hindu or something. When we were actually reading history, Mortimer Wheeler was one of the biggest names in especially Indus Valley. But actually then I came to know that he did not do any digs in Indus Valley civilization because he just went there for a couple of days as a kind of excursion or something. Then he was in Madras. Madras was actually one of the brains trust of India at the point of time. And then he came to Madras, and I think in one of the very important people, I forgot his name, he was the person who was actually like Mr. Nagaswamy now. He was actually probably the chief of archaeological survey of Tamil Nadu state. Then he was the one who gave him all the information. Then he went to Indus Valley site, and then a couple of days he was hanging around, and then he published his book. And this Aryan Dravidian divide was very, the argument was based on such a frivolous logic that he said that he discovered 3 dead bodies with, injuries, blunt or probably some kind of cut injuries. And he immediately jumped to the conclusion that there was an Aryan Dravidian fight, and there was also a reference to the Purandara, the concept of Purandara in the Vedas. Therefore, Pur was a Dravidian fortress, and then Indra, the Purandara, and the Aryan Indra killing the Dravidians and poor and all kinds of crazy things were actually peddled. And we all consume those things, to be honest. But I'm not saying that everything they said was wrong or whatever, everything we say is going to be right. That's also not that's what Sudarshan clearly mentioned, that we have to be open about even what we say. Okay. So that's very important, to have this critical distance. But if you read Ibn Battuta, if you read Ibn Battuta, if you read another famous Indologist, British Indologist, Monier Williams. We use the Monier Williams dictionary a lot, Sanskrit English dictionary. So when I read Monier Williams's work, he talks nicely about India. Then finally he says that the civilizing experience is that of Christianity. Okay. So Indians, for all their culture, religion, finally they can be civilized only by Christianity. Same thing with Ibn Battuta also. I think probably I was in Morocco. Jyotir and I were in Morocco just a few days ago. Ibn Battuta, for all his praise of the Indian culture and Indian tradition, whatever, then finally he cannot agree. He cannot make himself say that India is a great culture, but he has to always hyphenate it with Islamic culture or something. So it's okay. Those things are not really potent, but what happened with the systematic distortion, systematic creating a binary opposition between Tamil and Sanskrit, or North Indian, South Indian, all kinds of these binaries really create a kind of a bad political, social, economic, cultural situation in India, current day India. Okay. Now this is a time for decolonization of our mind. And decolonization is a term that is used by one of my professors, African philosophy professors, Kwasi Wirdu. The concept of decolonization, he used it for Ghana. And he was in 1950s studying in UK, in Oxford, and then he came out to Ghana and he saw that there was no way that they could understand their own culture through their own language. That was actually the ultimate decolonization of mind, right? If you cannot understand your own, I find it difficult to convey to my students. They're not able to analyze Indian concepts or Indian processes, politics, economy, culture, religion, arts, because we are all using the Western terminologies. That is fine, but we are not comfortable using Indian terminologies and understanding Indian concepts directly, because we don't have that access. This is completely, if you are in the US or UK or somewhere else, if you look at a gymnasium, they know where it is coming from. If you look at the sports system or education system or science and technology, you know where they are coming from. But here, you look at it, we have to read Tirukkural in English or Sanskrit in English, or everything has to be done through another language. I like English. I'm not saying that you should hate English or something like that. But it's actually the lens. The lens that you read is a kind of borrowed lens. And if you look at the problem in education and science and technology, sports, every system, every infrastructure, we have to borrow from the West, right? So that is because we have lost the connection of theorizing and also modeling from our own experiences. That's what it does. Basically, if you're living on a borrowed culture, you don't have your wherewithal, mental wherewithal to theorize for yourself, model for yourself, think for yourself. And that is colonization, real colonization of mind. So that was what has happened. And with the explanation of the Dravidian, basically obliterating the Dravidian Aryan theory. It's not a theory really, because it was just postulated to create a binary. So it's an excellent paper, final paper, and it was quotations from Sangam literature onwards, then Periyar and Tirukkural and many, Thayumanavar, Tirumular, and also very interesting contrast between the trajectory of Dravidian movement in Tamil Nadu and Narayana Guru's movement in you can see that the Eedavas are actually dominating the political landscape in Kerala, whereas the Dalits are not dominating the political landscape in Tamil Nadu. Because the one was created basically to divide, the other was created to empower. So that is the main difference. Thank you very much for excellent questions, and it's a great panel. I hand over the mic once again to the organizers. Thank you.
Thank you very much.